How did an ancient people cross thousands of kilometers of the Pacific Ocean, only to build a civilization on one of the most isolated islands on Earth, and perhaps even more mysterious? How did they carve and move enormous stone statues weighing dozens of tons without modern machines, roads, or metal tools? Far out in the Pacific Ocean lies a volcanic island known to the world as Easter Island, but its indigenous people have always called it Rapa Nui. Scattered across its dramatic landscape are hundreds of gigantic stone figures known as the Moai. They stand silently beneath the Pacific sky, facing the island as if watching over the descendants of the people who created them. For centuries, these statues have inspired theories about lost civilizations, environmental collapse, mysterious rituals, and forgotten technologies. But the real story of Rapa Nui may be even more fascinating than the legends. Because this is not simply the story of giant statues. It is the story of extraordinary Polynesian explorers, a civilization that learned to survive in isolation, and a people whose culture survived centuries of devastating change. So what really happened on Easter Island? This is the story of Rapa Nui and the civilization of the Moai. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Rapa Nui was already home to a remarkable Polynesian society. But how did the first people reach an island located thousands of kilometers from other major centers of Polynesian settlement? The answer begins with the extraordinary navigational abilities of ancient Polynesian sailors. These voyagers crossed enormous stretches of open ocean in traditional canoes, without modern maps, engines, GPS, or magnetic compasses. Instead, they studied the stars, the position of the sun, ocean currents, winds, waves, and the behavior of seabirds. Their knowledge was passed from generation to generation through oral traditions and practical experience. At some point during the first millennium CE, Polynesian settlers reached Rapa Nui. They arrived with plants, animals, tools, and the knowledge necessary to establish a permanent settlement. The island was volcanic, isolated, and challenging, but it offered fertile areas where crops could be grown. The settlers began cultivating sweet potatoes and other crops, building homes and establishing communities. Over many generations, these communities developed their own traditions, social structures, religious beliefs, and artistic styles. Rapa Nui gradually became a distinct Polynesian world, separated from the rest of the Pacific by enormous distances. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. These people did not simply discover the island. They learned how to make it their home. As Rapa Nui society developed, something extraordinary began to appear across the volcanic landscape. The people began carving enormous human-like figures from volcanic stone. These statues would eventually become known as the Moai. But the Moai were not simply giant sculptures created for decoration. They were deeply connected to the ancestors and spiritual traditions of Rapa Nui society. Many researchers believe the statues represent important ancestors, leaders, or powerful members of communities whose spiritual presence continued after death. The statues were commonly placed upon ceremonial platforms known as ahu. Their presence transformed the landscape into a world filled with ancestral monuments. The largest concentration of Moai can be found at Rano Raraku, a volcanic quarry where the statues were carved. Standing inside this ancient quarry today is like looking into a frozen moment of history. Some statues were completed and transported away. Others were abandoned during different stages of construction. Some remain partially embedded in the volcanic rock, showing exactly how the ancient craftsmen worked. The carvers used stone tools to slowly remove the surrounding volcanic material. Day after day, they shaped the body, shoulders, arms, and enormous faces of the statues. Some Moai reached extraordinary sizes, and once a statue was finished, the challenge was only beginning. It still had to be transported across the island, and that raises one of the greatest mysteries of Rapa Nui. How did they move these enormous stone giants? For generations, the movement of the Moai seemed almost impossible. Some statues weighed several tons,
guide our path.
The largest completed examples were enormous, and transporting them across rough volcanic terrain would have required extraordinary organization. Early theories suggested that the Rapa Nui people used massive wooden sledges or rollers. Other theories proposed elaborate systems involving ropes and wooden structures. But archaeological experiments have produced another fascinating possibility. Some researchers have demonstrated that a moai could potentially be moved while standing upright. Large teams could attach ropes to the statue and coordinate their movements. By pulling from different directions, they could make the statue rock from side to side. With each controlled movement, the statue could gradually advance, almost as if it were walking. This idea is particularly interesting because some traditional oral traditions describe the statues as having walked to their destinations. Whether this technique was used for every moai remains uncertain. Different statues may have required different methods depending on their size, route, and destination. But the experiments demonstrate something important. The Rapa Nui did not need modern technology to accomplish extraordinary engineering feats. They had ropes, they had stone tools, they had human strength, and most importantly, they had organization and knowledge. Moving a massive statue was not the work of one person. It required an entire community working together. And when the moai finally reached its ceremonial platform, it became more than a piece of stone. It became part of the spiritual and social identity of the community that created it. At its height, Rapa Nui was far more than an island covered with mysterious statues. It was a functioning civilization. Villages were spread across the island. Families cultivated crops, prepared food, built homes, crafted tools, and participated in religious ceremonies. The island's volcanic environment provided stone for tools and monuments, while the surrounding ocean offered marine resources. But agriculture presented challenges. Rapa Nui had limited fertile land, strong winds, and a climate that could change over time. To survive, the inhabitants developed ingenious agricultural techniques. One of these involved using stones to protect crops from wind and help retain moisture in the soil. These stone gardens allowed the people to produce food in an environment that was not always easy to farm. Society itself was organized around communities, ancestry, status, and religious traditions. The moai became powerful symbols within this system. They represented the connection between the living and their ancestors. Ceremonial platforms became important centers of community life, and the construction of these monuments required cooperation on a remarkable scale. The Rapa Nui therefore demonstrates something often forgotten when people look at the island today. They were not simply mysterious statue builders. They were farmers, navigators, engineers, craftsmen, religious practitioners, and members of complex communities. For centuries, their society adapted to one of the most isolated environments on the planet. But eventually, the island itself began to change. For much of the 20th century, the story of Easter Island was presented as one of the world's greatest examples of ecological collapse. According to the classic theory, the inhabitants cut down the island's forests to build canoes, transport moai, and expand their settlements. Eventually, the trees disappeared. Without forests, the soil supposedly became vulnerable, agriculture collapsed, conflict increased, and civilization destroyed itself. But modern research has made this story much more complicated. Deforestation certainly occurred. Human activity played an important role. But researchers have also investigated the impact of Polynesian rats, which may have consumed palm seeds and prevented forests from regenerating effectively. Climate changes and the island's naturally limited resources may also have placed additional pressure on the population. And perhaps most importantly, the people did not simply disappear when the environment changed. They adapted. Agricultural techniques changed. Social structures changed. Religious traditions changed. The construction of giant monuments eventually declined, but the Rapa Nui people continued living on their island. This means that the popular image of an isolated civilization suddenly destroying itself may be far too simple. Rapa Nui was not a single dramatic collapse. It was a long process of environmental, social, and cultural change. And the greatest tragedy in the island's history was still to come. It would arrive not from the ancient forests, but from across the ocean. In 1722, a Dutch expedition led by Jacob Roggeveen reached the island on Easter Sunday. That encounter gave the island the European name by which it became known around the world. But for the Rapa Nui people, this was not the discovery of a forgotten island. It was the arrival of outsiders in a homeland where their ancestors had lived for centuries. European contact introduced a completely new chapter in Rapa Nui history. Over the following generations, diseases brought from outside populations devastated communities that had no previous exposure to many of them. Then, during the 19th century, the island suffered another catastrophe. Peruvian slave raiders captured large numbers of Rapa Nui people. Among those taken were members of the community who possessed important cultural knowledge. The loss of elders and leaders damaged the transmission of traditions and history. Disease made the situation even worse. Later, foreign economic interests transformed large areas of the island into sheep ranches. In 1888, Chile annexed Rapa Nui. For many years, the indigenous population faced severe restrictions on movement and access to their ancestral land. Yet despite all of this, Rapa Nui culture survived. The language survived. Traditional dances survived. Stories survived. Craftsmanship survived. And most importantly, the identity of the Rapa Nui people survived. The Moai remained standing as silent reminders of their ancestors. Today, Rapa Nui is one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes on Earth. Hundreds of Moai remain scattered across the island. Some stand upon their ancient ceremonial platforms. Others lie where they were abandoned centuries ago. And deep inside the volcanic quarry of Rano Raraku, unfinished statues still remain attached to the rock. They provide a rare glimpse into the moment when ancient craftsmen stopped working and left their creations behind. For centuries, outsiders looked at these statues and saw a mystery. But archaeology has gradually revealed something more meaningful. The Moai are evidence of a sophisticated Polynesian civilization. A civilization capable of extraordinary navigation. A civilization capable of organizing enormous communal projects. A civilization that developed innovative agricultural techniques. And a civilization that endured environmental pressure, political change, disease, slavery, and foreign control. Perhaps the greatest mistake is to describe Rapa Nui as simply a lost civilization, because the civilization did not completely disappear. The descendants of the original inhabitants still live on the island. Rapa Nui traditions continue. Its language continues. Its music and dances continue. And the Moai continue to stand above the landscape. They are no longer simply mysterious statues. They are symbols of ancestors, identity, survival, and cultural resilience. So perhaps the greatest mystery of Easter Island is not how the Moai were built. And it is not even why the ancient forests disappeared. Perhaps the greatest mystery is how a small Polynesian society, isolated in the middle of the world's largest ocean, managed to preserve its identity despite everything history placed in its path. The Moai have stood silently for centuries, but their story is far from silent. What do you think is the greatest mystery of Easter Island? How did the Rapa Nui move the enormous Moai? Why did the island's environment change? Or how did the Rapa Nui people survive centuries of extraordinary hardship? Tell us your theory in the comments below.